You're at an open-air museum that recreates life in rural Ontario around the mid-1800s. It has over 40 heritage buildings, some of which are original, some of which were moved here from elsewhere. During the day, people visit to see history come to life through costumed interpreters attempting old trades and walking through gardens seeing animals. But at night, it takes on a very different atmosphere. Armed with bravery and a flashlight, visitors walk through and listen to stories of people who live there as dark shadows surround them. And they're often not alone.
We had one person at the village tell us that he could hear books, pulling themselves off the shelves in the minister's office inside that building. And then he would go over and look. Nobody would be in that minister's office.
I'm Nadine Bailey, and this is Haunted Canada. Today, we're traveling through the village of Black Creek. The village of Black Creek, formerly known as Black Creek Pioneer Village, is located about 35 minutes from downtown Toronto. It's just west of York University and overlooks, as you may have guessed, Black Creek, which is a tributary of the Humber River, which is one of two major rivers on either side of Toronto. The land is rich with deciduous English oak trees, elms, and white poplars, and was originally settled by the Stong family in 1816. But before them, it was the ancestral land of the Huron-Wendat, the Iroquois, and the Anishinaabe. Elizabeth Fisher was born on October 30th, 1798, and was just 17 when she married Daniel Stong in January of 1816. Daniel was 24, and like her brother, had served in the War of 1812. Elizabeth never knew her father, but in 1796, he had received a land grant for Lot 25, Concession 4 in York Township, now the southeast corner of Jane and Steeles, but he had died before clearing the land. When her brother died during the War of 1812, Elizabeth had inherited the 100-acre lot. Daniel and Elizabeth arrived at her lot soon after they married to find a forest of giant oak and pine trees. Clearing land provided the wood for building their first home, and before winter fell, they had completed a tiny 3-room square log house with a large stone fireplace by Black Creek that would serve them for the next 16 years. The Stongs cleared farmland and raised a family in the log home, and little did they know that the house would become the oldest building near Toronto. In the early years, Elizabeth had only the simplest cooking utensils, designed to work over an open fire, and some of them still hang beside the fireplace today. In 1817, Elizabeth gave birth to their first child, Mary Ann, followed by a second daughter, Catherine, the following year. As the family grew, Daniel worked on building a farm out of the virgin forest. Keeping livestock over the winter was difficult, so it was common to butcher the animals in the fall and preserve the meat. A smokehouse was added right outside the front door in 1820 and was divided into 2 rooms, one for butchering and the other for smoking the meat. Salted pork helped the family survive the cold winters, and Daniel raised the pigs a few steps from the house, which must have smelled pretty nasty when the wind blew from the south. In 1821, the family celebrated the birth of Jacob, their first son, and the second, John, was born a year later. A grain barn was added in 1825 to the prospering farm, and between 1826 and 1831, Joseph, Michael, and Samuel were added to the family. That means 9 people were living in the tiny 3-room log house. Daniel and Elizabeth had one room, the two girls the other, and the boys slept in the living room. They had the luxury of being the closest to the fireplace in the winter. But it was tight quarters, so in 1832, Daniel built a second home for the family. It was a red two-story house with a nice covered porch, and it had a greatly improved cooking area complete with a 7-second bake oven, meaning if Elizabeth could hold her hand in the oven for more than 7 seconds, it wasn't hot enough yet. This little homestead is where Elizabeth raised her brood of children and where their 8th and final child, Daniel Jr., was born. In 1837, Daniel, along with his oldest son Jacob, joined the rebel farmers in the fight alongside William Lyon Mackenzie in the insurrection against the oligarchic government of the British colony of Upper Canada. The Upper Canada Rebellion, as it became known, was largely defeated soon after it began, but resistance lingered until 1838. After the uprising, Daniel was arrested and held in jail. It must have been a horrible time for the Stongs, but thankfully, Daniel was eventually able to return to Elizabeth and the farm. The years went by as the land continued to prosper until 1845, when tragedy struck. Michael, their second youngest child, died. He was only 17 years old, and he was buried on the northwest corner of the property. Daniel eventually donated the land, and it became known as the Town Line Cemetery. It is the resting place for most of the Stong family and their neighbors. In 1854, Mary Ann died at the age of 37. She was the eldest daughter, and that same year, the eldest son, Jacob, bought the east 80 acres of the farm to raise his own 10 children. He built a 2-story brick farmhouse with a large front porch, and it still stands today near the corner of Steeles and Keel. A year later, the family built a house on farmland adjacent, and Samuel moved in. Many of the adjacent farms were occupied by the Stong children. The house on that north side property has been moved to its present location within the village. In 1868, Elizabeth lost Daniel, her husband and lifelong partner, and she relied on her large family in her older years. She was to suffer again in 1882 when she lost her second daughter. In her lifetime, Elizabeth survived 3 of her children before passing away on March 30th, 1885. Jacob continued to care for the farm, and he passed it on to his son Alfred, who passed it on to his son. Oliver Stong farmed the family homestead until 1952. Unlike most other pioneer families, the Stongs never tore down the earlier buildings to reuse the materials, so the property was purchased by the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority in 1958 because of its unique collection of historic buildings. Black Creek Pioneer Village opened in 1960, and the east end of the property is now home to York University. In addition to the Stong family buildings, the majority of the other buildings were moved from their original sites across southern Ontario, like the large halfway house and the Mennonite meeting house, while some other buildings were rebuilt and reassembled piece by piece. The village today is made up of the original Stong family farm buildings, a water-powered grist mill, a general store, a blacksmith shop, along with over 10 other trades buildings, a hotel, a church, and a one-room schoolhouse. The village is a regular destination for field trips by school children from the Greater Toronto Area because of its historical interpreters, craftspeople, reenactments, and the visiting artisans housed in the restored buildings. But almost since the day it opened, staff have noticed strange things happen, and they have always felt like they were never truly alone. Irene Blaney is a tour guide for the Haunted Walk at the Village. She says that since it opened in 1960, staff have witnessed strange and unexplained occurrences, and the Man's House is often the location of the scariest interactions. The Man's was originally built in 1835 in Richmond Hill, Ontario. It was originally located on Yonge Street and served as the residence of the minister for the Richmond Hill Presbyterian Church from 1849 until 1885. The neoclassical style home was typical of small Ontario village houses in the 1830s and was built with a plank-on-plank construction, which means the walls consisted of 2 by 6 inch boards laid one on top of another, with alternating planks offset to create a kind of keen effect. Over the years, it served several roles, including as a store, residence, Sunday school, and a church office. The Man's was moved to the village in 1978 in 2 pieces to complement the Fisherville Presbyterian Church, which is also on site. Since its arrival, it has gained a reputation, and Irene admits that she doesn't like to be inside it alone.
I have a bit of a complicated relationship with the Man's, mainly because it is probably one of the most haunted buildings that we have on our tour. It is one that certainly we have quite a lot of activity in, not only our tour guides, but also people who work at the village during the day. And it was built as an accompaniment for the church for a home of a reverend. And the reverend who lived in that building for a good portion of his life was known as William Jenkins. Quite an intense person from our research that we've got. He was very dedicated to his faith, maybe a little bit too much in some regard. We definitely have some stories of maybe his more strict side, but we believe that he is sort of that spirit that is at the Manse. And like I mentioned, people who work at the village during the day have even told us that some of them flat out refuse to work in that area of the village or have asked to be transferred out just because of not only the atmosphere inside that building, but also because of these strange things that have happened.
The paranormal activity they mention is specifically centered in the minister's office.
We had one person at the village tell us that he could hear books, pulling themselves off the shelves in the minister's office inside that building. And then he would go over and look. Nobody would be in that minister's office. So we've had a few things like that. I know on our own tours, I have one colleague who will frequently go in there, and we actually have a running joke that, the ghost just doesn't like them because every time they go there, something will happen.
The Man's isn't the only building with a reputation. The church that sits next to the cemetery is another dreaded location.
The church is a bit of a tricky one, mainly because we actually attribute much of the activity there to the cemetery that is right next to it. And that cemetery is something that is original to the property there at Black Creek. Some members of the Stong family are still buried in that cemetery. Actually, their son, who died quite young, is buried there. He was the first person to ever be buried there. So we attribute a lot of the sort of activity that happens around that area to that cemetery and the people who might be resting there as well. There's been a few spottings of some figures standing around that area, particularly like a sort of apparition of a little boy dressed in old-fashioned clothing. There are quite a few young children buried there, so we've done quite extensive research to try and figure out who this boy may be, but we don't really have any sort of definitive answers, really just guesstimates at this time. But he has been spotted both during our tours and during the tours of the village during the day as well. It's more seeing him sort of in the cemetery sits like basically flush up against the church. So people have seen him sort of through the window sometimes. When walking up to the church, people will see him just in the cemetery, sort of off to the right there. And he unfortunately disappears before much can happen, but he is known to be quite playful.
Many believe that the figure is the ghost of a little boy who just wants to play.
There was an instance where he played peekaboo with one of the guests on the tour and then just disappeared.
The manse and church aren't the only buildings with the distinction of being haunted. Roblin's Mill is one of the few surviving stone mills from the early mid-1800s in Ontario, and the only operating stone mill in the Toronto area when functioning. It serves not just as a static artifact, it helps tell stories of labor, trade, local economics, and how rural communities were connected. The mill was constructed by Owen Roblin in 1842 in Ameliaburg, Prince Edward County. At its peak, it could produce up to 100 barrels of flour per day, but it closed in 1920 after years of decline, partly due to competition from other more modern mills. It was scheduled for demolition, but found a new home in the village when the original timber, flooring, and machinery were moved and reconstructed in Black Creek in 1964. Irene says employees are adamant that the spirit of the owner, Owen Roblin, is the figure they've seen standing in the doorway.
I think the mill is another one of the ones where we've had some spottings of, figures. People often are very uncomfortable about the windows in the mill. They often, when we're walking on tours, they're like, oh, it feels like there's someone, like kind of watching me from that building.
I mentioned earlier that Daniel and Elizabeth's children all built homes and lived in adjacent land. Samuel Stong's house was built around 1855, and Irene says this is where she has had some terrifying experiences.
So it has 2 floors, and the upper floor has we've definitely heard some noises coming from up there, some thumping. When I've been in there setting up before the tour, I've also heard a lot of creaking coming from upstairs. Go upstairs. There's no one there. So it's a bit unsettling when you're in the building by yourself and you hear these things, but...
Irene leads ghost walks, so she's braver than most and doesn't get scared easily. And although she does know many of the buildings on site have their ghostly distinctions, she does have a favorite.
The one that I really love talking about and love bringing my guests into is Second House. It's one of the buildings that is original to the property there. So Daniel and Elizabeth Stong, when they first sort of settled there, they built this tiny little log cabin that is known as First House. And, their family got quite big.
Built in 1832 for his growing family, it is a beautiful 2-story house that showcased the Stongs' growth and prosperity after 16 years of homesteading. It was built on a fieldstone foundation with squared logs and dovetail corners, has clapboard siding, a brick fireplace, and bake oven, along with plenty of space for their 6 sons and 2 daughters.
And it's this beautiful building. Like when you go inside, buildings just aren't made that way anymore, and it's really gorgeous. One of their sons, Michael, he died at quite a young age when he was about a teenager. There was a bit of a tragic hunting accident, and he was actually brought back to his bedroom in Second House, which is where he passed away. So, since the village opened in 1960, and certainly since we've been doing our tours there, we have definitely noticed this rather mischievous spirit, we'll call, in that area. And we all refer to him as Michael. When I go in there for my site supervising shifts and I'm unlocking the building, I always say, "Hey, Michael, how's it going?" Because he is what we really assume that spirit is there. But both the employees at the village during the day and us have heard most consistently footsteps in that building, particularly on the second floor of the building. So you'll be on the lower floor, and there's a very specific area where you will hear someone walking upstairs in the hallway. But you go upstairs, you look around, and there's no one there. There was an occasion where some employees at the village during the day were kind of closing up for the night. They went upstairs, made sure everything was locked, made sure everything was good. And then as soon as they were going down to to close the door, they heard those heavy footsteps thumping upstairs. And so they're like, oh, someone must have just, been in the building. They walked back up. No one was there. And in fact, there's chains in this building that sort of separate the areas where there's artifacts from where the public can walk. And that chain in the upper room there was swinging back and forth. And these chains are something that, the caretaking staff who come in later at night, they've also told us, like, we've seen these chains swinging randomly. And on one of my tours last year, actually, in one of the lower rooms, I was just talking, and all of a sudden, the chain in the lower room started to swing when my group was in there.
Because of its reputation as a haunted location, every fall as the leaves turn and the weather gets cooler, the village at Black Creek transforms into a festive, spooky, family-friendly place with lots of interactive and fun Halloween-themed activities.
So a lot of the activity my colleagues experience, again, varies. It could be if we heard knocks this one time we were in a building, or, I definitely heard the footsteps. It's not unfortunate that not every time we go into a building we can predict exactly what's going to happen, because we don't plan any of this stuff. It was around actually last Halloween. And they told us about this experience they had. They were telling this story, and all of a sudden everyone in their group sort of started screaming, and they weren't really sure what happened. Everyone got frightened, and they heard this like hiss behind them, almost like someone was like scoffing or grunting or displeased with what was happening in the building. And they were like standing with their back to a staircase. So they whipped around to see, who was, no one there. And when they asked everyone why they had started sort of screaming and getting upset, they said they had heard this big crash coming from upstairs. And, the tour guide hadn't heard it because they were telling a story. So they went upstairs, looked around to see if anything had fallen down, and nothing. But several people had heard the thump, and several people had heard the hiss behind the tour guide. No explanations for either of them. And Berwick House is another one that, we've had a lot of experiences in, similar to that.
But when the sun goes down, those brave enough can do something a little bit creepier by taking in the paranormal and experiencing one of the many spirits that call the village of Black Creek home. Thank you for listening, and a special thanks to Jerry Smith, Guest Services Supervisor, and Irene Blaney from The Haunted Walk for all her help with this episode. And thank you to the Central Counties Tourism for partnering with me to write this story. Haunted Canada is sponsored by the Edmonton Ghost Tours. I will link it in the show notes. Haunted Canada is written and produced by me, Nadine Bailey, with senior producer Dila Velasquez. Production and sound design is by Rob Johnston. If you would like to support this podcast, please follow and share. And if you can give us a like and a 5-star written review, that is always appreciated. Also, you can follow me on our different social media platforms like TikTok and YouTube. Or if you have a ghost story, haunting, or true crime that you would like for us to cover on this podcast, please email me through the website hauntedcanada.com. And I would like to say a big thank you to everyone who has sent me emails letting me know how much you're enjoying the podcast, and for sending me your own ghost stories and hauntings to cover on this podcast. Thank you from all of us at Haunted Canada and Curious Cast. Have a good night, everyone, and stay haunted.